This may take a moment. It sometimes takes a minute for my computer to do screen sharing, but let's see how we do here. Oh, that was actually fairly fast. Okay, so great. Again, Barbara, thank you for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Tonight's talk is the monarch and its migration. And Barbara and I were talking before the meeting began because I have given a talk on monarchs at a meeting of this chapter of the Sierra Club before. And that was a very exciting evening to give a talk because we were actually having a blizzard. And I was working at the Nature Museum and actually was driving out in the middle of the blizzard to meet up for the talk. So that was very exciting. One of the reasons that I was trying to figure out when exactly that was is that I have, between then and now, added a bunch of stuff to the talk. One of the things that's happened between then and now is I have been to the Monarch Wintering Reserve in Michoacan in Mexico, and I've got some images and video from that trip. So there will be some stuff that if you were here at that time for my last talk, you will have seen already, and there will be some new stuff as well. So the monarch migration takes the monarch between up here in the northern US, where the last picture was taken, down to the mountains of Mexico. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but you can really see that the butterfly in this picture is in the mountains of Mexico. And you can see it's sort of faded and a little bit tattered. You can tell that this butterfly has made a long journey. One of the things that I'm going to be coming back to a number of times in my talk is the relationship between monarchs and milkweeds. And this can be a little bit confusing at times because milkweed, it turns out, is a really, really great nectar source for adult butterflies. And so monarchs and a whole bunch of other species of butterflies will come to blooming milkweed to feed on. But that's not the special relationship between monarchs and milkweed, because adult monarchs can take nectar at a whole wide variety of different plant species. It's the caterpillars that have the very specific relationship with milkweed. This is monarch caterpillar, and milkweeds and a few closely related species are the only things that monarch caterpillars can feed on. So that's the really close relationship that people will cite between monarchs and milkweeds. So what we're going to cover this evening, we're going to talk about the timeline for the monarch in Illinois, or at least from a perspective of Illinois. Monarchs have a very complex annual life cycle, which is distinct from the individual life cycle. The individual life cycle is the egg, the caterpillar, the pupa, and the adult, which is the life cycle that a single individual will undergo. But the species has an annual life cycle, and we're going to talk about that through the lens of Illinois. We're going to talk about where they migrate. We're going to talk a little bit about how they navigate. We're going to talk about what they do in Mexico. And we're going to talk about some findings of the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network relative to monarchs and some of the implication of these findings for conservation. So the Illinois timetable for monarchs, coincidentally, this is the slide I always use when I give this talk. And we are starting right about at the top of the list here because we're just about the time that the monarchs arrive from further south. I have not yet heard of any sightings in the Chicago area, that it would not surprise me at all if somebody has seen one, but I've definitely heard people from as nearby as, say, Champaign-Urbana reporting seeing monarchs and actually seeing females laying eggs on the milkweeds in their yards. So the monarchs are going to be either just here or arriving within the next week or so. And basically, as soon as they get here, they're going to start laying eggs. And the milkweed is not even fully up, but they don't care. They will lay eggs on emerging milkweed. Unfortunately, at this time of the year, the milkweed is growing faster than the caterpillars are, so that, that works out well for them. So this generation of monarchs that the adults are just arriving and laying eggs, the generation that is going to come from those eggs, is going to get through its entire life cycle and get to emergence of the adults from the chrysalises by late June to early July. And between early and mid-July, the adults that emerge then are going to be flying around, feeding, mating, and laying eggs. And we will have another generation of adults emerging in late July. Now, when the adult monarchs are up here in the summertime, the lifespan for an adult butterfly is only about 2 weeks. So by the time this late July brood is emerging, everything that came earlier is pretty much died off already. These late July adults are going to emerge, mate pretty much immediately, lay eggs, and this will go on through early August, and by late August, the first of the adults from that generation will begin emerging. That generation is going to be very different from the previous generations. The decreasing day length that we experience here as the summer gets into August is going to trigger production of a compound in the caterpillars and chrysalises called juvenile hormone. And so when those adults emerge in late August into September, they're going to be physiologically and behaviorally very different from the two generations that were present earlier. They're going to be a little bit bigger, and unlike the previous two generations, they are not going to excuse me, begin mating and laying eggs immediately. They're in what is called reproductive diapause, and diapause is simply a cessation of activity. So they are not reproductively active at that point. The monarchs in the previous two generations were pretty much solitary individuals. They would only really interact with each other for mating. This late summer generation of monarchs starts aggregating, and they will start roosting communally in trees and shrubs. And they're going to begin preferentially flying to the south and southwest. This is the migratory generation of monarchs. And so the adults that emerge at about that time of year are going to begin flying south. There are also going to be adults that have emerged further north of here into Wisconsin, upper Michigan, Minnesota, and Canada. They're going to get here around that time, around the first and second week of September. And that is when the peak of the wave of monarch migration passes through the Chicago area. It varies a little bit from year to year, but it's remarkably consistent over time. It's not going to be off by more than about a week or so. So where are the monarchs going? Well, this is Mexico here. You can see a little bit of the Gulf of Mexico here, the Pacific Ocean here. Mexico City is right here. And this star right here is Morelia. And Morelia is the capital of the state of Michoacan in Mexico. Here is a closer up view of that area. Here is Morelia. Here is Mexico City here. And on this map, you can see this sort of sinuous dark green line here. These are mountains, and the darker green are coniferous trees that grow at higher elevations. This is called the transvolcanic belt. It's called transvolcanic because it in fact is a volcanic mountain range, and it runs mostly east-west. And so it runs across between the Sierra Madre Oriental, the Eastern Sierra, and the Sierra Madre Occidental, the Western Sierra in Mexico. So this is the mountain range that joins the two of them. And this is where the monarchs are going. Let's zoom in a little bit more. You can see between Mexico City and Morelia, here is Mineral de Agangueo. And that is where the monarch reserve that most of the pictures in this talk comes from. However, it should be noted that at the proper elevation, there are about between a dozen and 24 roosting sites all through the transvolcanic belt here in the Mexican states of Michoacan and the state of Mexico. So zooming in a little bit further, here is Agangueo, that town. It's called Mineral de Agangueo because there's quite a bit of mining that goes on there. Here's the mining town here. And up in here, up in the mountains, in the coniferous forest, is the Monarch Reserve. This photo was taken in Pátzcuaro, which is fairly close to the Monarch Reserve. And I include this picture because I mentioned the transvolcanic belt. This is a volcano, and the volcanoes in this part of Mexico have a very characteristic appearance. Most of them are dormant. There are a lot of them. A lot of them are very small, and they have this very squared off top, and it's a very characteristic appearance of the volcanic mountains in the transvolcanic belt in Mexico. It's a beautiful part of the world. If you ever get the opportunity to visit the Monarch Reserve, it's a wonderful place to go. The scenery is incredible. The botany is incredible. The birding is incredible. And if you go to the right places, the butterflies beyond just the monarch are incredible too. However, at the time of year that the monarchs are there, up at the elevation where the monarchs are staying, the monarch is the only species of butterfly that I have seen there. You have to get to a lower and warmer elevation to see other species during the overwintering period. However, the monarch is absolutely spectacular on the wintering grounds. If you think about the eastern part of the United States, everything east of the Rockies, the monarch in its summertime will extend from southern Canada about midway down the continent from the Rockies east to the Atlantic. That entire population of monarchs gets squished down into about a dozen sites, none of which is more than about 20 acres in size. What this does is it gives you an incredible density of monarch butterflies. You can see the monarchs on the branches here. You can see them weighting the branches down. And you can see the monarchs from the air. This is an aerial photo. I did not take this photo. I wish I had the opportunity to see this from this vantage point and take this photo. But all of this orange here on these trees, these are roosting monarchs. This photo has never ceased to amaze me, that there are that many monarchs that you can see them at this density from this distance. So the monarchs are leaving here, they're leaving Canada, they're leaving New England, and they're getting to these 20 small sites west of Mexico City. How do they find their way? Well, they appear to use both the sun and the Earth's magnetic field to navigate. However, I should mention that the evidence for magnetic field use is pretty thin. And since I first started giving this talk, I have not managed to uncover any additional evidence for experimental results confirming the use of the magnetic field. So that's a little bit iffy, but they definitely use the sun to navigate. And the sun compass makes use of the monarch circadian clock. So it's important that the monarch circadian clock has an idea of what time of day it is, and it's measuring the angle of where the sun is in the sky against the time of day. On the southward migration, the same butterflies make the entire trip. So the butterflies that you see leaving here in Chicago in late August and September are going to be the exact same butterflies that end up in Mexico. And this can be up to 2,000 miles away. We know this because of tagging. People put little adhesive tags with data labels on the monarchs, send them on their way. They get to Mexico, and people down there have retrieved butterflies that the tags have been affixed in Canada. So we know it's the same butterfly making the entire journey. None of the butterflies has ever been there before. Remember what I was saying about how many generations there are here in the summer. It is the great-great-great-grandparents are the most recent generation of monarchs to have been in Mexico. So it's not like certain species of birds where you've got the older individuals that have made the journey before that can impart the information about where to go to younger individuals. None of the individuals that are going have ever been there before. How they find these exact same roosts year after year is one of the great mysteries of nature, and one of the reasons that I find it so rewarding to study butterflies. So here is just some other shots of the monarchs roosting in Mexico. What do they do while they're in Mexico? Because there are a couple things that we didn't know. People have known that the monarchs migrate late in the summer for a long period of time, but it wasn't until the mid-1970s that the scientific community finally found out where the monarchs were going in Mexico. For a long time, it was thought that they were going someplace south and warm and avoiding the cold of winter. In fact, they're going to a fairly high elevation where it's not that warm. Then it was thought that the monarchs were just hibernating, that they would go there and just roost in the trees and hibernate. But that's actually not entirely the case. And what they actually do is more interesting than that. They actually change their use of the forest over the course of the winter. So when they get there, and they're going to arrive late October, early November, they choose roosts that are on the southwest face of the mountain. They arrive around the 1st of November. Here they come. Boom, there they are up there at the top of the hill. And they take a while to settle down. They'll kind of test different microsites within the roosting site, but in fairly short order, they settle down fairly high in elevation. This is over 10,000 feet in elevation. And once they settle, this is the closest they come to true hibernation. For about a month, there's little activity. They have low metabolism. And they will roost in these giant pendulous clusters. You can see this is just tons and tons of, many, many, many monarchs waiting down the branches here. And it almost has a bag-like appearance to it, although they're not bags. They will also roost on the trunks of the trees. Here's a whole bunch of monarchs on the trunk and some more pendulous clusters of them here. Here's a close-up of one of the clusters. You can see it's just a whole bunch of monarchs packed in really, really tight with each other. Here is the tree trunk. This image I sometimes use as my screensaver image on my computer because it's just a really nice pattern. And to see them is absolutely amazing. This is a warmish day in January. As the day progresses, the butterflies become a little bit more active. This is taken a little later than the little activity, low metabolism. This was taken in mid-January of 2017. And it's just amazing to be around this many monarchs. So by the time you get to like mid to late January, you're seeing the kind of images that I was showing there. The activity of the monarchs increases, their metabolism goes up a little bit, and they start following watercourses downhill during the day, although they're still staying in the forest. And they begin feeding and drinking. And what you see when you are actually in the monarch reserve is that there are these wooded areas that are fairly shaded, and that's where the monarchs roost. Interspersed with them, there are these more open fields. And the open fields have watercourses running through them, and they have a lot of blooming plants. And so as the sun starts heating the monarchs up, they will leave their roost, they will begin flying downhill, and then they will go into these more open areas and feed. So this is sitting in the woods, and what you've seen is a river of monarchs. I'm pointing upstream in the river here, going from roosting in the trees, which are ahead of me, to a field full of flowers that is behind me. And here is part of that field behind me there, which is a moist area. And in addition to feeding, they are taking moisture in the damp sand there. So very, very magical experience to get to see all of that. So this takes you through most of February, this type of behavior. Then as you get into March, their activity increases even further, but there's an even more important change. They're moving further downhill, they're becoming more active, there's more feeding and drinking, and they leave their reproductive diapause. Now, remember, these are the same monarchs that emerged from their chrysalises way up here in North America, way back last August. It's now March, and the lengthening day length stimulates them to come out of reproductive diapause, and they begin mating. And most of the mating happens before they depart from the winter roosting site, although additional mating happens during the northward journey. And this is from late February in the early 2000s, and things start getting very active then. And if you're on the reserve periodically, you will end up in these monarch blizzards. This is before I was taking video. I really wish I had taken video on this trip. You can also hear them. An entire tree will often take wing at about the same time, and that many monarchs flapping their wings at the same time, it sounds very much like a waterfall. Just an amazing experience. So by mid to late March is when the departure happens. There they go, bye monarchs. A few males may remain, but most of the monarchs depart from the wintering site at this time. So this is the return trip. Now, this first bullet point has been a little confusing in the past. So the monarchs do not complete a full breeding cycle while they are in Mexico. When they arrive, the vast majority of them have not yet mated. They don't mate while they are spending most of the winter there. They mate just before they leave, but they don't lay eggs. So they begin flying north. And when they reach the Rio Grande Valley, basically, that's the first time they encounter native milkweeds. And that is where they dump their eggs. Most of the adults then die. And it is the progeny from those eggs that when they become adults by late April, early May, begin flying northward, and they are what get here by mid to late May. So just before we leave that, a couple more pictures of roosting monarchs in the hills of Mexico. Now, people have been talking for a while now about monarch decline. I would like to say a little bit about monarch populations and monarch population numbers. So in Mexico, how do you figure out how many monarchs are actually there? You've seen the pictures. There are way too many to count. Nobody's going to stand there under the trees and be going, 1, 2, 3. You'd never get through it. So the way they do it takes advantage of this density of monarchs that you can see in the aerial photo here. And what they do is they figure out the total area that is occupied by roosting monarchs. And so in Mexico, the unit of measure for the population annually is in acres or hectares. And they go to all of the sites that are currently known, they figure out the area, they total it all up, and you get one number per year for this is the population for this year's wintering monarch population. And there's been a lot of media about it because people have been concerned about declining monarch numbers. And while there is reason to be concerned, there's been a lot of misuse of the data here. And I'd like to give just one example of how the data is not necessarily used well and how to be a better consumer of data and information about monarch populations. One of the things that you will still see is people setting 1996 as the first date to do the analysis and 2014 as the last date to do the analysis. This is the relative population size of monarchs in Mexico. The numbers here are in hectares. And this looks really, really, really terrible. This looks absolutely like disaster is impending. But the question comes, why are we starting in 1996? Because monarch populations were measured somewhat before 1996, not a lot, but somewhat. And why are we ending in 2014? So let's zoom out a little bit and look at more of the data. Monarch populations in Mexico have been measured since the early 1990s. And this is all of their numbers up till this past year, the last winter. And a couple of things that you want to notice here. First of all, 1996 is very much an outlier. And in fact, this outlier of 1996, a huge and poorly understood population boom that year, has been seen by multiple monitoring programs. It's been seen by the Mexico counts. It's been seen in the summer of 1995, the previous summer, here by the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. It has been seen by the Ohio Butterfly Monitoring Network. It has been seen by counts done by the North American Butterfly Association. The 1996 number has two features. Feature number one, it is real. Feature number two, it is an outlier. It is unusual and above the background for that time. Setting this as your starting point, whereas the starting point on average back in the 1990s was somewhere more in here, is a really clear-cut case of cherry picking your data, and it's going to make your data look a lot worse than they are. Similarly, choosing this year down here is your endpoint is also cherry picking your data. And yes, there has been a decline, and yes, we should be concerned about the decline, but it is not as dire as this graph makes it appear it is. Something else that I want to mention about numbers of monarchs from year to year and how they can be not used in the best way by the media. Notice there's been a decline between the 2020 and the 2021 censuses in Mexico. And this year, and it is utterly predictable, screaming headlines all over the place. Monarch population decreases by 24% in Mexico. It did, but look at how much monarch numbers normally vary year to year to year. Again, I am not saying that there isn't a problem with the monarch decline, but it's really, really important to keep in mind what specific numbers mean. The simple fact of the matter is any single year over year variation in the monarch is not really terribly meaningful. It's the long-term trends that are meaningful. Also, people love to scream about disasters. So you heard a lot about the 24% decline between 2020 and 2019, and 2020 and 21. You did not hear anything about the 256% increase in population size between 2018 and 2019. So be a good consumer of information about the monarch butterfly when you hear some of these alarming things being stated. Nonetheless, there is a decline that has been observed in the wintering populations of the monarch, and there are three main hypotheses cited for the population declines. The first is illegal logging, and a lot of Lincoln Brower's work focused on this. And there has been a lot of illegal logging in the reserves in Mexico. The Mexican government has clamped down really seriously on this. It hasn't gone away entirely. It may be contributing to the decline. It is probably insufficient to explain the entire decline. And the preserves tend to be increasingly protected from these types of activities. The second is climate change, including drought, freezes, and storms. And in particular, this is a very dramatic thing that happens from time to time. That I mentioned that these areas are very high up, and that this is not a tropical winter vacation in Mexico that the monarchs are taking. In fact, the reserves, there is frost most mornings. When I was there a few years ago, I was wearing a coat most mornings when I was there. And every so often, there's a big storm that comes through. And it causes a lot of mortality. Now, all of these monarchs are probably not dead here. These are cold-blooded animals. A lot of these are just probably torpid on top of the snow. When the sun hits them again, a day or so later, many of these will take flight again and fly back up into the trees. Nonetheless, these are significant mortality events. I'm going to show some data in a little bit that is why I do not think that these winter storm events are a major driver of the monarch decline. And the final reason has to do with agricultural changes in this country precipitated by the advent of certain genetically engineered crops. And I'm going to say quite a bit about that in a moment here. And the question I want to ask is, are these really contributing? And if so, how are they working against the monarchs? So the genetically engineered crops, and this is not my picture, by the way, there have been two rounds of concern about genetically engineered crops, and they both work very differently from each other. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about how they work. The first was back in the late 1990s, and the problem that it was looking to solve can be seen here. And I'm sure we've all seen this when you buy sweet corn in the summertime. Occasionally you'll open an ear and you'll find it's all nasty and there's a caterpillar inside. This is corn earworm. And so something called BTK corn was introduced in the 1990s. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, and it is a bacterium that produces a naturally occurring insecticide. It should be noted that the bacterium itself is not genetically engineered. This is a completely naturally occurring bacterium. In order to combat corn earworm, the gene for the naturally occurring insecticide from the bacterium was introduced into corn. And this would cause the corn to produce the insecticide, the protein that has insecticidal properties. And therefore, the caterpillars would not get a chance to get anywhere near this big before they died from it and would not damage the ears of corn. And in the late 1990s, there was a laboratory study that said if you took pollen from this transgenic corn and dusted it on milkweed leaves and fed them to monarch caterpillars, that it was toxic. And there was a lot of concern for that. There were a lot of studies that were done in the few years following that. And I could give an entire talk on those studies. Suffice it to say that there has been no convincing evidence that this particular transgenic corn has had an effect of monarch populations in the field. it's one of these things where under laboratory conditions, under highly unnatural conditions like that, it would have an effect, and this effect did not seem to translate into the field. Fast forward about 10 years, and we get genetically engineered corn problem number 2. And this picture here shows what the problem that this type of corn was developed to combat. You can see here's all the corn growing here, and here's all kinds of weeds growing here that have not allowed the corn to really establish in this part of the field. Now, this one works in a way that's a little bit more complicated. This is the Roundup Ready corn, and the idea here is you engineer all of this corn so that it's not at all affected by the herbicide Roundup. And then when the field is much, much earlier in the year than this, when the corn is just starting to come up and so are the weeds, you very heavily treat the entire field with Roundup. And the idea is all of the weeds die from the Roundup, but the corn is resistant to the Roundup, and so it keeps coming up without the competition that the weeds would have otherwise given it. It's important to remember a couple of things about this. First of all, unlike the BTK corn, the transgenic corn itself is not said to be directly affecting the monarchs here. So it's not an effective direct toxicity to either the caterpillars or the adult butterflies. Instead, the product results in a major change in agricultural practices that influence how much milkweed there is in agricultural fields. And so are genetically engineered crops to blame? You've got this massive spraying of these fields by an herbicide that is going to kill off the host plant of the monarch. And this is leads to the milkweed limitation hypothesis. So the widespread planting of this corn has been coupled with a significantly expanded application of the herbicide Roundup. And there's now a second generation of that uses a different herbicide. Neither the corn nor the herbicide is directly toxic to the butterfly. Instead, the widespread use of the herbicide has led to significant declines in host plant. This is the milkweed limitation hypothesis. And it should be offered as a caution that this is still a hypothesis, and that there is quite a bit of evidence on both sides of this particular hypothesis at the moment. So there have been policy responses to the population decline. In 2014, a petition was filed to protect the monarch under the Endangered Species Act. A couple of things to know about this. Here are the petition plaintiffs. Center for Biological Diversity. I will say more about them in a moment. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This is a group based out of Portland, Oregon. And they've been around for quite a while. They're a group that is specifically about insect and conservation of insects and other invertebrates. And a good way for a lot of people to think about the Xerces Society, they're a little bit like an Audubon Society for bugs. I am a member. Dr. Lincoln Brower. Since the petitioning, Dr. Brower unfortunately has passed on. He was one of the real serious monarch scholars and did a lot of field research and has really advanced in very significant ways understanding of monarch biology. And the final group is the Center for Food Safety. And I mention this because I have kind of mixed feelings about the group of people who petitioned for the listing of the monarch. It turns out that both the Center for Biological Diversity and the Center for Food Safety do not have insect conservation or indeed conservation at all as their primary goal. They're really anti-GMO non-governmental organizations. And so they do have a particular stake beyond the monarch in this debate. Couple of other things to realize: the filing is not for endangered status, it's for threatened status, and that the threat is to the migratory populations only. There are monarch populations in many parts of the world. It is an introduced species in Southern Europe. It's found on a lot of the Pacific Islands. It's found throughout much of the Caribbean. It's found through Central America into South America, although there is some thought that you get beyond a certain degree south in South America that it's actually a closely related but distinct species. But globally, the monarch is not in danger of extinction. And the petition does not claim that it is. It is claimed that the migratory population is threatened. So having said all of that, I'd like to take a little bit of a look at some contributions that the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network has made to this debate. The Butterfly Monitoring Network was founded in 1987, and it uses volunteer data collections. Anybody can become a butterfly monitor, and if you want to become a butterfly monitor, I would be more than happy to talk to you about how to do so. I have not updated this slide yet. It says here it includes North and Central Illinois and Northwest Indiana, all of which is true, but we have had a recent effort and we now have quite a bit of monitoring going on in the far south of Illinois. It's using something called a Pollard Transect protocol. You can see somebody performing one here. Basically, you walk a set route through a particular site repeatedly over the summer, and every time you walk, you count all of the butterflies that are seen within 20 feet of yourself while you're walking. The Butterfly Monitoring Network is not a monarch-specific program. It surveys all butterfly species, but certainly the monarchs are included in that, and we have a very large, robust monarch presence in our data set. And I really need to update this slide because we are now up to over 16,000 surveys that have been deposited in our database. So this is a very large, robust data set. So we've already talked about how to get an annual population size for the monarchs in Mexico. How do you get one from here in Illinois? So what I've done is for each year in the Butterfly Monitoring Network, I found all of the routes where monarchs were recorded. I throw out any routes that didn't record the start and stop times because that's a very important part of the analysis. You have to correct for effort. And then I calculate for that entire summer the total number of monarchs that everybody saw, and I divide that by the total amount of time that they were out looking. And that gives a single population size for the year. And here is what you get when you do this. Now, this cuts off at 2017 because this is part of a paper that was published. Actually, this should cut off at 2015 because that's when the paper was published. And what you can see is it jumps around a lot from year to year. Oh, there's 1996 sticking out like a sore thumb. One of the things you might notice is this kind of looks reminiscent of the numbers that we saw in Mexico. Well, that's kind of interesting. So a lot of the analysis that was done with this were comparing the numbers that we see in Illinois with the winter numbers in Mexico. And so here we've got the Illinois numbers in blue, the Mexico numbers in yellow, and indeed, they are rising and falling very much in concert with each other. This resulted in a publication that made use of our monarch data. I should mention that this publication did a lot more sophisticated statistics than what I was talking about, they have been talking about here. Leslie Reese, the lead author on the paper, works at a much higher statistician pay grade than I do, and she did the more involved statistics. And the paper came out in 2015, and it's called The Disconnect Between Summer and Winter Monarch Trends for the Eastern Migratory Populations, possible links to differing drivers. And the approach for this paper to say that prior to this paper, most of the population analysis had used that data from the winter. And this data compared those winter data with data that the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network gathered here in Illinois in the summer, and the North American Butterfly Association's data from the northeastern US that was gathered with a different protocol. And so the comparative study was between these two data sets and the winter roost data. And we found a number of interesting things. The IBMN and the North American Butterfly Association data strongly correlated with each other. This is important because these use different protocols for collecting data, and the strong correlation suggests that we were seeing something that actually exists out in the field. The summer data from the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network strongly correlate with the data from Mexico from the following winter, but only weakly correlate with the data from Mexico. I'm saying it wrong. The summer data are strongly correlated with the data from Mexico the previous winter, only weakly correlated with what you're going to see in Mexico the following winter. And this is why I believe that the winter storms are not really a significant driver of the population decrease, because what seems to set the annual population is their reproductive success up here in the north during the summer months, rather than their survival over the winter in Mexico. Our data suggested that the population decline that was observed in Mexico has actually been steepening since 2008. And most controversially, we did not see a significant decline in the summer populations as measured by either the IBMN or the North American Butterfly Association's data sets. And this created a great deal of controversy. First, a rebuttal was written to our article in the same journal. This rebuttal was not a peer-reviewed study. This should be viewed more as an editorial. And they provided three main critiques. They said that egg counts are more effective than adult butterfly counts because you can actually go out into the agricultural fields and attempt to detect the eggs. We did not directly survey agricultural habitats, although a lot of our survey sites are located immediately adjacent to agricultural fields, particularly agricultural fields where corn is being raised. And that our surveys focused on the vicinity of Chicago. And to hear the critique, you would think that all of our data collection was being done between the Loop and O'Hare Airport. Here is an example or an illustration of the survey sites just in the Chicago metropolitan area. And these extend well out from Chicago into the suburban and beyond into the agricultural parts of the Chicago metropolitan area. And additionally, there's a lot of monitoring going on downstate as well. We were about to respond to this critique, and before we had gotten our response together, Dyer and Forrester, who were not part of our study, came up with a critique of their own. And this is that critique also in the same journal. And the key quote from their critique, which should also be viewed as an editorial and not a scientific study, is that these are all good criticisms and should be taken as relevant caveats to any conclusions from the feature summary. The feature summary is our paper. However, to adequately reject a null hypothesis of no decline in summer populations, simple verbal models such as those presented in the critique are not sufficient. And they called for additional study and more complex modeling. The additional study, some of it has been done. The modeling is not really being conclusive at this point in either direction. Meanwhile, others are contributing to the debate. Shortly after our paper was published, Inamine and co-authors published in the journal Oikos, linking the continental migratory cycle of the monarch butterfly to understand its population decline. They used the same NABA set that we did, but they did not include Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network data, but they also included other programs that monitored the population during the migration in funnel points, where the topography of the land funnels migratory monarchs into small areas, so there are lots of them. And places like Cape May, New Jersey, Peely Point in Ontario, and Peninsula Point in Michigan are all examples of this. And they examined temporal trends in the population relationships. How well does one part of the annual cycle predict the next? As was the case with us, they found no significant decline of the summer populations. They found that northern populations are able to build up annually despite winter declines, which is similar to what we are saying. They make what I consider perhaps an excessively bold statement: the milkweed limitations hypothesis is not supported. I would characterize the milkweed population limitation hypothesis as being a still validated hypothesis in need of additional testing. Their conclusions seem to indicate that the breakpoint appears to be the autumn migration, although there are other studies that suggest that a significant factor is how successful that first generation in the spring in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas is. So why does this matter? Well, the endangered species petition to list the monarch has important implications to a variety of stakeholders. Significant pushback is likely, and in fact is happening, from those with an economic interest in the listing, and weaknesses in the case will be pursued. My concern here is that gains a lot of traction and that the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, and this serves to weaken the Endangered Species Act as a whole. Secondly, lots of resources are being applied to this issue. And there are huge amounts of dollars being put into planting and expanding habitat, which basically is being taken to mean milkweed at this point. The good news is that's not a bad thing in and of itself. However, if the milkweed limitation hypothesis turns out not to be supported, we may be wasting these resources. And the other thing is there are a lot of species that are in significantly more trouble than the monarch. This is the swamp meadowlark extirpated from Illinois that is an example of such species. And resources may be diverted for other species that may actually have greater conservation urgency. The swamp meadowlark, the regal fritillary, and the Carner blue, which this last one has been extirpated from the Chicago metropolitan area since about 2012. So these species are all species that are in very serious trouble. So with that, I will end my part. Very special thanks to Leslie Reese, my partner in crime in the 2015 paper, and the United States Forest Service, who has funded some of my travel down to Mexico to see the monarch wintering site. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing now and take questions.
Thank you, Doug.
Oh, this is Allison. I was going to say we've got 3 questions so far in the chat that we can start with.
Okay.
All right, the first one is, Doug, do you know if the monarchs are affected by nighttime mosquito abatement fogging?
The answer is sometimes. I'm aware of one case, this is anecdotal. When the museum was first opening, I got a phone call from a mosquito abatement district in Minnesota, and they had this was in late August of that year, and they had sprayed and they found what they said were all kinds of dead butterflies around after they sprayed. And I knew what was coming, but I said, can you describe the butterflies? Well, they're big and they're orange and they've got like black stripes on them. They had managed to spray right at the height of the monarch migration. So this is something that clearly can potentially be a problem for monarchs.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question. This comes from Kathy. Do you agree with people raising monarchs or just letting nature take its course? And if someone does raise them, when should they stop raising them?
Here, I think the Xerxes Society has some excellent advice. Raising monarchs, there are a couple of things about it. First of all, it's a lot of fun. And second of all, it can be very educational. It's probably not going to have much of an effect on the conservation of monarchs in terms of increasing the population size. And one of the problems with home rearing is that rearing monarchs in large quantity, particularly in a setting where you don't have a laboratory setting, disease can be and is often a serious problem. The Xerxes Society recommends not rearing more than a dozen caterpillars when you're doing your home rearing. And I think that's good advice.
Right. All right, the next question comes from Pat. She would like to know a little bit more about how variables are being explored for the milkweed decline hypothesis.
Oh boy, that's getting a lot of study. And there are people who are studying it from a botanical standpoint and trying to actually go out and do surveys and try to calculate how much milkweed has been lost as a result of the shift to Roundup Ready corn. The amount is rather large. A few years ago, Greg Spirius from the Natural History Survey published a paper on this that was done here in Illinois. And that's shown that there's been a large quantity of milkweed lost. And then there are continued monarch population studies that are trying to correlate these different variables.
All right. All right, we had another question from Trisha, and this is about one of the photos you shared, the aerial photo of the forest from above. She would like to know if there was clear cutting present in that picture. She thought she saw that there.
These areas have been farmed for centuries. These are actually owned by indigenous communities who live in the Transvolcanic Belt. And the areas that you saw in the background that were agricultural fields have been agricultural fields for a long time. What's changed more recently with the clear cutting, a lot of the clear cutting for a while back in the late 2000s was being done by organized crime out of Mexico City. And they would actually send trucks and crews out to the reserves. They would hold the residents at bay at gunpoint. They have held biologists at bay at gunpoint. The Mexican government finally clamped down on it and did a big raid. A number of those people are still in prison. But the clear cutting was going on at a higher elevation. The open fields were at somewhat lower elevations where it's a little bit warmer, a little bit more suitable for agriculture, and it's a more mixed forest. It's not the fir trees, which is where the monarchs spend the majority of their winters.
Okay. Next question is about the graphs you shared depicting the winter populations in Mexico. Rena would like to know if the data behind those graphs is available for people to view.
Those data are collected annually by the World Wildlife Fund and are available through their website. And those data also get published in the scientific literature, but most of that is behind paywalls and can't be readily accessed.
Okay. All right, another question from Pat. She says, so if the hypothesis of decreased milkweed availability has not been shown to be supported, why is there an effort to increase milkweed plantings?
Because we can't. If the milkweed hypothesis is not supported, then it's much less clear why the monarchs in Mexico are decreasing. The nice thing about milkweed is if you do that, there's no real harm in doing it. It's not an approach that has a lot of a downside to it. So the best you're going to, I should say the worst you're going to do is not much. The best you're going to do is increase the monarch population. And the milkweed limitation hypothesis is still very much in play as a possibility.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the questions in the chat. If anyone else has a question, you can come off of mute and ask it or add it to the chat.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question that I think I just don't have the energy to type. So, Doug, say again the winter versus the summer. I mean, it seemed like maybe the slide said one thing and you said, I'm a little confused about that. So just say again about the summer population versus the winter population and which one is more, seems to control the other one, or what?
And, you know, it's weird. I've given this talk a bunch of times, and this is the first time I've noticed that the slide is wrong. So the correct answer is what we see in the summer in Illinois, when we sort of put all of those data together and get our one annual number, that's a really strong predictor of what's going to be seen in Mexico the following winter. What you see in Mexico in the wintertime is only very weakly predictive of what you see in Chicago the following summer, what you see in northern North America. Now, for a long time, I was saying that it wasn't predictive, but I mentioned Leslie, who has a much higher statistical ability than I do. She was able to do some more sophisticated analyses that could show that weak relationship, but it's a much weaker relationship than the very strong relationship between what you see here in the summer and what you're going to see in Mexico the following winter.
Okay, so that strongly suggests that it's something, if there is a decline, it is very possibly due to something that is happening in, you know, up here.
It seems to be more related to something up here than it is to survival on the wintering grounds in Mexico. It could be a number of things up here. It could be reproductive success in Texas in the spring, and there's some evidence of that. It could be milkweed availability up here further north in the midsummer, and there is some evidence for and against that. And it could be success in migration further south in the autumn, and there is some evidence for that as well. It could be a combination of these things.
Thank you.
So Doug, you were saying, if I understand correctly, that there's a population of monarchs that are born that have never been to Mexico, and yet somehow they get to Mexico, and then they come back halfway. They're in Texas, and they have never been to the Midwest, and somehow they get to the Midwest. I mean, I know bird migration, but you know, it just seems like we have several stages here where they could. Why don't they just stay in Texas? How do they go anywhere?
Well, one thing too. I think the southward migration in the winter is a little bit harder to understand than the northward migration. The southward migration, they're finding these couple of dozen tiny little spots on mountainsides in Mexico. And they go back to these same mountainsides year after year after year. And their navigation, the way they use the solar compass, basically our understanding of that is sufficient that we know how they know where south is. And so what I've likened it to is for me to give you my car keys and say, I want you to find this one parking lot in Zitácuaro, Mexico. You don't have a map. South is that way. Good luck. And that's kind of the level of our understanding of how they find these same places. Northward, it's a little bit less mysterious because they're just kind of dispersing and breeding their way further northward. They're not really ending up in tiny specific spots the way they are when they go
Yeah,
south.
that makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
So there are certain flyways too going south.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, my family and I, we drove out to Pittsburgh where my parents lived, and we stopped in at Pele Point. You know, it's just 5 hours away from here, just east of Detroit, and it's like clockwork. You know, not only do you see sharp-shinned hawks at a certain very specific time of year, but also you see monarchs when they're migrating, and it was just fascinating. But it's an old land bridge, part of the remnants of an old land bridge that went across Lake Erie, and so they know to fly along that, even though the land bridge is just the point now, the southernmost point of Canada. So that's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I think what's probably actually happening there, it's just they don't like crossing the lake. So the lakeshore kind of funnels them down, and then they get to the point on Pele Point, and their only choice at that point is to go across the lake. And they will often roost in places like that until the winds become favorable. You see several of those. There's Pele Point, there's Cape May in New Jersey, and there's a similar area on the Lake Michigan part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the land funnels into Peninsula Point, and it does the same thing.
Wow, that's really, yeah. I'm going to have to go back, and there was so much information in your presentation, and I missed a big chunk of it. I got kicked out, so I had to come back in. So if there, I just wanted to, I did put some things in the chat regarding Seizure, but Kathy, who was our Monarch Pollinator Committee Chair, also posted some stuff about that committee and joining and being a volunteer for that very relevant committee tonight. So does anybody else have any comments or questions for Doug?
Well, I would like, there's another question in the chat from Bobby Ferguson. He says, you stated, I think, that people raising monarchs has no material effect on total population. If 1 million people raised 10 butterflies each, it would add 10 million butterflies. Wouldn't that change things?
Well, first of all, we don't have anywhere near that many people raising monarchs. And second of all, really with the monarch, what's going to drive their long-term success is having habitat. The other thing to remember is that there are billions with a B of monarchs when you total up everything that's on the wintering grounds in Mexico every year. So from that standpoint, 10 million is a drop in the bucket.
Okay. Well, thank you. Ed, go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I'm just wondering whether Kathy Menke wants to say anything about our relatively new Monarch team.
Can you hear me? Oh, great.
Yes, yes.
I'm up in the North Woods right now, so I wasn't sure if I could be heard. But yes, we're still looking for people to join our committee. I did put in the chat how you can reach me if you'd like to get involved.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, we got a good turnout tonight. Last night, I think I saw 45 as the high water mark. So thank you, everybody, for coming out. And thank you very much, Doug. Really very enjoyable and very informative presentation. And, obviously very relevant to now, So unless there's any other questions or comments, I really appreciate everybody being here. Uh-oh, did I get frozen? Oh, no, I didn't.
You're good. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Doug.
Thank
I'll be
you.
sending out a recording of the session tonight so everyone can watch it all over again. Send it to your friends. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for that, Allison. All right. Good night, everybody.